Last week, I finally watched Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, and while I had a lot of thoughts on the film, I haven't yet felt like I know exactly what I'd say in a video about it. However, it did remind me how much I love Robert Eggers' work, and it got me thinking about one of his films that I've always loved, but felt was somewhat incomplete. And since I'm assuming you clicked on this video because of the title and thumbnail, I don't see any reason to beat around the bush anymore, so let's dive into Robert Eggers' beautiful and brutal Viking revenge tale, The Northman. But before I do, I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. Now without further ado, let's get started. I discussed this movie a little bit in a video the year it came out, where I counted it among my 3 favorite films of the year, so I don't feel like I need to spend too long gushing over the gorgeous cinematography, the immaculate attention to detail and historicity in the sets, props, and costumes, and just being a surprisingly ambiguous and thought-provoking take on a simple tale we've all heard 100 times. Plenty of reviewers and video essayists have already done their best to make up for the film's disappointing box office, which I believe was a result of it being too weird for most audiences, and not weird enough for fans of Eggers' past work. So, that's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to address what I consider the story's biggest issue, as well as a couple other things at the end. So, what is this issue? Well, let's start by examining the film's themes. Oh, and there will be spoilers if you didn't figure that out. I'm really bad at making that disclaimer. Anyway, in case you didn't know, The Northman is an adaptation of the Icelandic saga that originally inspired Hamlet, so it's a pretty familiar premise. However, while I'm not sure how much of this was straight from the source material and how much was the writer's own unique twist, it turns out to be quite an interesting subversion of the classic revenge tale. Amleth is established early on to be a not-so-nice dude, working as a berserker mercenary for a band of slavers and committing every horrible atrocity you'd imagine people in such a line of work to commit on the job. And as he goes about his quest for revenge, his excessive acts of violence and terror are frankly sadistic. Still, we want to root for him. That is, until we learn that Amleth's father was not the man he thought and his mother was far from a helpless victim, and his uncle Fjolnir is recontextualized as a loving husband and father trying to put his past behind him and protect his family. This revelation shakes Amleth's conviction, and his motivation changes from vengeance to protecting his lover and future children. It really shows the cyclical nature of violence and the futility of vengeance, and it challenges our obsession with the culture that celebrates such horrific behavior. But it's not really clear how much the protagonist himself grows and changes. While his motivations shift from hate to love, there's no real apparent guilt or atonement for his past actions. To be totally clear, I'm not saying all protagonists need to have such redemptive arcs and end as heroes. Stories can have dark antiheroes or even villain protagonists that remain static from start to finish if that's what works for that story. The issue with the Northman is that without any semblance of repentance on Amleth's part, I have a really hard time buying his relationship with Olga. See, Olga was the victim of Amleth's atrocious actions early in the film. He, along with his fellow berserkers, slaughtered her family and friends in front of her eyes, destroyed her home, and condemned her to a life of servitude. He should be the villain of her story. She has even more reason to seek vengeance on him than he does to seek vengeance on Fjolnir. Yet though she recognizes him when he brands himself and stows away on the slave ship, she doesn't show any hint of hard feelings towards him, and it's not long before she chooses to join him in his quest. You see the problem here? It would frankly make more sense for her to start out as an antagonist in his story, trying to kill him for what he did to her, and forcing him to confront the horrors of his own actions, leading him to seek her forgiveness as their relationship develops. This would just make far more sense for her character and their relationship, as well as making the film's themes about the pointless destruction of violence and the deconstruction of Viking culture more complete, in my opinion. So let's take a look at how I'd incorporate this arc into the story. So in the film, not a whole lot happens between their arrival in Iceland and when they bang in the woods, at which point they really start scheming to bring terror down on Fjolnir's family. But they're basically working together right from the beginning. In my version, when Olga and Amleth first start talking, she's actually even more friendly. As she learns about his mission, she tells him that she can help him like in the film, but she's not just proposing a mutually beneficial alliance. She's openly offering herself to him in more ways than one. Increasingly, the way she talks with him becomes suggestive, even flirty, though that seems like the wrong word in this historical context. Anyway, at some point once they've arrived at Fjolnir's homestead, Olga comes on to Amleth in private. But as soon as he lets his guard down, she strikes with a small knife or other tool we might have seen her find and conceal earlier. However, while she leaves a scar that could be referenced again later on, he prevents her from landing a fatal wound and turns the tables on her. With her at his mercy, he tells her he ought to kill her after having his way with her, and in response, she curses him for what he did and calls him all sorts of horrible insults, even goading him to do to her what he and the others did to the rest of her family. Instead, he tells her she's not who he came to kill and lets her go. As he turns to leave her, she tells him that she'll tell Fjolnir who he is, but he sees through the empty threat, pointing out that she wouldn't have just told him that if that was her plan. He asks why she wants him to kill her so bad, whether she just wants to rejoin her kin or whether she wants the validation of knowing he's really the monster she hates so much. To which she retorts by asking if he's any less a monster than the one he hunts, which gets a rise out of him, but he ultimately lets her go, leaving her still angry, but seemingly conflicted. This interaction softens her feelings towards him thanks to the mercy he shows at his own risk, but that last bit also plants the seeds for the later revelation. Fast forward to the party in the woods after the brutal ball game. Before the two get it on, I like to imagine a brief conversation between them, where she asks him why he saved Fjolnir's son in the game. He tells her something like that he doesn't kill children, to which she responds that he could have just watched like he watched her family be slaughtered. It's an accusatory comment, but it's not as harsh as her earlier accusations, and she seems genuinely curious about him. He has no reply, and perhaps for the first time, we see what might be a hint of guilt in his eyes. She then adds that she noticed, even back in the raid, that he was different, that he didn't seem to take pleasure in what he did like the others, and he responds that he's never known pleasure, not since the day he lost everything. Of course, she then asks him to let her show him pleasure before they get busy and officially team up, and I imagine that he uses the incentive of freeing their fellow slaves from her village to get her to join his quest. Fast forward again to after they've been caught and then escaped, where I'd add a moment in which Amleth finally admits to Olga that she was right about him, that he was no less a monster than his enemy. And she tells him that, before today, she would have believed that. She admits to having seen him as little more than an animal or a tool to be used, that she didn't think he was capable of love. But after having seen him willing to sacrifice himself in his quest to save her, she now sees the man within the monster. It's at this point that their relationship becomes one of open affection and genuine love, rather than merely an alliance with, benefits. And that's about it for their arc. I feel like this additional growth on Amleth's part not only makes him a slightly more heroic protagonist by the end, and makes the film's condemnation of the culture's glorification of violence more explicit, but more importantly, it makes his relationship with Olga far more nuanced and believable. Now, I might have made a couple other slight additions as well, though nothing too critical to the story. I probably would have added an extra scene showing Fjolnir and his family in private shortly after the terror begins, showing him as a loving husband and father fearing for the safety of his family as he comes to believe his past actions have come back to haunt him. This would make it a little easier to sympathize with him once his past is recontextualized. I also feel like Amleth's motivations for doing a 180 on the ship and swimming back to finish what he started are a little weak. He says Fjolnir will never stop hunting them, but in the 9th century world, I imagine it would be pretty darn easy to disappear. If they change their names, find some village in the middle of Europe, and start an unassuming peasant life, their enemies would have no way to track them. So I might have had someone on the ship try to take them back and turn them in for reward, warning them that Fjolnir will stop at nothing to find them before Amleth kills him. This inspires his fear that they'll never be safe unless he finishes his quest. And as long as I'm offering suggestions, I've got to point out my biggest pet peeve, which is that, as awesome as the raid scene is, it makes absolutely no sense. Robert Eggers is renowned for his insane attention to detail and devotion to historical accuracy, earning this movie the reputation of the most realistic Viking movie ever made. So it's rather shocking how ridiculous this sequence is. Why are these raiders targeting such a well-defended settlement rather than some defenseless hamlet? Why is this little village so well defended? And considering how well it's defended, why the heck did the defenders have any trouble repelling the attack? There's dozens of fully armed soldiers already on guard on the wall when they show up. There's no way these half-naked hooligans would get over it with so many people shoving spears in their faces as they're trying to climb it. So, while it's a well-directed action sequence that Eggers has every right to be proud of, it's by far the most unrealistic part of the film. Anyway, that's it for my criticism of the movie, but while I'm talking about it, I would like to take just a moment to say that if Robert Eggers is open to the idea of making sequels, which I kind of doubt, I would love to see the film about Amleth and Olga's children. The story of how the daughter of an escaped slave would become a maiden king, as prophesied by the Norn, would be absolutely awesome to watch. If you'd let me indulge my imagination for a bit, I assume Olga would find someone to marry as soon as possible, because raising multiple children while making a living as a single parent in the pre-modern world would have been virtually impossible. From here, I imagine a story in which Olga's husband was abusive, and when her children were teenagers, her son killed him in her defense, kicking off a chain reaction of events leading to the son's death, with the daughter then seeking to avenge him, using political manipulation to turn her enemies against each other and rise to power herself, of course demonstrating her skill in combat in the process, and earning her place as the ruler of her people. Is this a movie worth making? Well, I'd totally watch it, though I admit that if I were Robert Eggers, I would want to make sure there was at least as much compelling character development and thematic depth as the original before deeming it a story worth telling. Like I said, I suspect Eggers is the kind of director who treats every film he makes as a dive into a completely new world, and having explored the world of the Northman once already, he'd probably rather do something new than go back to it. He can do whatever he wants, but I'm just saying, I would be more than happy to see the next chapter of this potential saga. But yeah, that's about all I've got on the Northman today. I know this video was pretty rambly, but hey, I was up all night thinking about all this, and the whole point of this channel was just to share those thoughts with you, so I hope you enjoyed. I really enjoy making these kinds of videos where I get to just ramble about how I could do better than all my favorite directors. In all seriousness, I hope I don't come off like I think I'm a better writer than the professionals I admire so much. I'm just having fun putting my writer's brain to work. As for upcoming videos, I'm still chewing on Nosferatu's themes, and I'm not sure if I'll have enough to say on it to justify its own video, but I do want to make a video about Robert Eggers' filmography in general, exploring what it is I love so much about his work, so keep an eye out for that in the near future. In the meantime, I'd love to know what you think of my additions to The Northman, and just what you think about the film in general. After all, I'm just here to kick off the discussion, so until next time, never stay silent.